I'm going to go back. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. So, how do we cooperate in this process? We can choose to cooperate or not with what God is doing in our lives, and that's kind of what we were just talking about with everything that took place yesterday. And so how do we choose to do that? Paul writes elsewhere in Ephesians 4, he says, put off your old self, which belongs to your former manner of life and is corrupt through deceitful desires, and be renewed in the spirit of your mind. So he says, put off your old self, throw that away. It's almost as though you're taking off a piece of clothing and throwing it into the dirty clothes. You're putting it off, and then you're being made new in the attitude of your minds. So all of this means, here again you see to be renewed in the spirit of your minds. Again, we're seeing this idea of our mind. So all of this we see is telling us that we must change the way we think. We must take on a thoroughly Christian worldview to see the world the way God sees the world. To put on what I've told you before, to put on Jesus-colored glasses. And then it tells us what the results are. Do not be conformed to this world. Don't live the way the world lives, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, by the way that you think. That by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. So we need to change the way we think. And the result is, when we do that, that we will be able to discern and live out God's will. People, which pleases God, by the way. People all the time are like, well, how do I know God's will? How do I know God's will? So much of God's will you can know just by knowing the Bible. God desires for you. I'm thinking of from Micah 6. He has shown you, O man, what is good, what the Lord desires of you, but to love to love mercy and do justice and walk humbly with your God. That's God's will for us. And it's as we do that, it's as we live the way God has told us to live, that he reveals those other sort of questions about God's will. What's God's will for my spouse? What's God's will for college? What's God's will? It's as we walk closely with God and as we do those things that we know are God's will for us, right? We know that his will is for us to forgive, just as we've been forgiven. We know that God's will for us is to walk as Jesus would walk. We know that God's will for us is to be in his word. And it's as we do those things then that those secondary issues can be discerned. So the result is that we will be able to discern and live out God's will, which pleases God. So God's will here is not so much who should I marry or what college should I go to. It's living out our faith day to day. It's becoming living sacrifices, which will help us with those other questions. But that's not ultimately the point. The point is to glorify God with our lives. So that's what it says. That's what it means. Let's move on to some application. Let's talk about the renewed mind. The first thing is that it is a process. I'm 60. You're 17, 18 years old. I've been walking with God more than twice your lifetime, right? So it would make sense that I've been through more experiences. I've walked with God longer. That there are things that I have learned, that I have seen, that maybe you haven't. It's a process. of growing closer to the Lord. I love the way Larry Norman puts this. It's called A Song for a Few Close Friends. And he talks about his friend Randy, and he says, that I can't remember the part for this, but he says, as we both crawl, like let's crawl together toward the lamp of Jesus, the light of Jesus. And sometimes it is a crawl, and it takes time. Look, if you made a decision for Christ yesterday, or if your faith was reignited yesterday, that reignition is fabulous. But it isn't always going to be this moonshot. It's not always going to be this fast, furious thing. There's a lot of times when it's what is Eugene Peterson say? A long obedience in the same direction. A long obedience in the same direction. And that's what a walk with Christ is. And not every day is like yesterday. But God is faithful, and God is with us nonetheless. So it's a process. And it's not automatic. It doesn't just happen. And so that means, therefore, that I must cooperate with God in this process. This is part of that cooperation, right? This is part of that cooperation. So then the question becomes, what am I feeding my mind? If I need a renewed mind and I'm going to walk in obedience with God, then what am I feeding my mind? Years ago, I would listen to, primarily when I was in the car, I would listen to talk radio. This is when I was a young mother. And I'm not sure that there was anything wrong with that. But I also noticed, and this is actually before I became a mother, because it was when I taught at Millard North. And I would drive every day from Bellevue to Millard North. And this is just true confession time. I'm a competitive human being, a very competitive human being. And to me, when I was 24, 25, 26, the interstate was a competition, and I had to win. And I would be so stressed out by the time I got to school, just from the drive there, like, getting in front of you. I gotta get in front of you. And I was always late. My fellow social studies teacher said that I believed that if I was in the school district by 7:30, which was when we were supposed to be in school, I was on time. And so now they weren't driving as far as I was. And so I decided, it was my husband that suggested it. He'd seen the way I drove. And he said, why don't you listen to KGBI? And so I started listening solely to Christian music in the mornings on my way to work. And it changed everything. I became, driving along. Bless you, brother, you must be a good pastor. It just changed my whole attitude. Now, there was that one time that I was listening to the song. I was very pregnant with Josh. Not very pregnant, but I was pregnant with Josh. I was listening to a song by Wayne Watson that's about his son's future wife. I actually read the lyrics at Josh and Kristen's rehearsal dinner. And I'm driving down the interstate going, I didn't even know if I was having a boy or a girl, and I'm crying. And so that wasn't so smart. But it changed me, this deciding to feed my mind with the truth instead of lies, instead of the truth of God, instead of the truth of man. It changed me by feeding my mind daily with the Word of God. And so it had an impact. The impact was significant. In fact, I found myself, when I stopped listening to secular music altogether, and I just listened to Christian music, I found myself, I don't sleep well, and I wake up a lot in the night, and I would wake up in the night with worship songs. And so it had an impact on me. And it had an impact on how I would respond to God during the day. Listen, what we feed our minds matters. Probably more, I would suggest, than what we feed our bodies. And so I just want to leave you with this thought, and it's this. Is there something that you are feeding your mind that is preventing you from having your mind be renewed, to be renewed in your thinking, and therefore hindering your worship of God, and making it hard for you to discern His will, which is whatever is good, acceptable, and perfect. And if that is the case, then might you be willing to begin feeding your mind? Okay, that's it for today. We will continue on with lesson 5, and I'm fairly certain we can get that done before Thursday, and that will be the last grade for some of you. Yes. No. Yes, you may.